Our son Ken was this incredible kid, and he was really smart and athletic and just a really kind-hearted human being. You know, he was always the one willing to help. He always had an ear for his good friends, and he was the kind of kid that he fit into every group at high school. Everybody liked him. I never met any kid who didn't like him. You know, he would meet kids in the mall and, hey, Kenny, and just a really good, kind-hearted human being. And he had little quirks when he was younger. And as a young parent, you don't know what those little quirks mean. In March of 2006, unfortunately, we kind of figured out what a lot of his quirks meant. He was having a rough time. He was an avid swimmer, and all of a sudden he just didn't want to go to swim practice. And all of a sudden he didn't want to go to school. And we kind of struggled for a few months. We thought he might have mono. March 19th, 2006, he was just really acting very odd, and a good friend of mine who's a child psychologist said, bring him to the hospital for an evaluation. And it kind of blew me away, like, what do you mean? And so I just did it, and Kenny came with me very willingly, and I really wasn't sure what she meant by evaluation, but I guess I did, but I didn't want to accept that. And that was when we realized that Kenny had suicidal ideation. That morning he had come up with a plan. He thought if he went out in the woods and he cut the main arteries in both his arms, and that if we did not find him, that we would not miss him if we didn't find his body. And that was when the day our lives changed. He was admitted into a psychiatric hospital that day, and it was probably I have to say, the hardest day of my life. I know some people say wasn't the day he died the hardest day. Well, that was a hard day because our lives, as I said, changed. Here I went from having a bright, incredibly academic kid who was in math honor classes, who was a star swimmer, who girls had crushes on. One would think the perfect kid, to someone who wanted to end his life, and I don't know, we didn't know why. Like, I keep going back to the hospital when we were in the emergency room that day, because when the doctor says to you, well, we're going to admit him, and it's like, well, you think you're going to go to a hospital, what everyone traditionally feels is a hospital, but the psychiatric hospitals are very different, and I have to say, when I first went, it was kind of shocking. Again, in one day you learn your child has plans on killing themselves. You wait 12 hours in the emergency room at the regular, normal hospital, and then you find you have to go to a psychiatric hospital, and you get there. Your child has to be taken in an ambulance, and they're tied down to the stretcher because you don't know. And that's the other thing. While they're in the hospital, they have to be on 24-hour watch. They cannot be left alone. All of a sudden, you realize, like, oh my gosh, my kid could kill himself, and he's got to be watched 24 hours, and he can't be left alone because he might sneak off and hurt himself. It's just this unbelievable thing to face, because it's like, oh my gosh, this is my kid who yesterday was healthy in my mind. He was normal in my mind, and now it's like, it's just so different. And then you get to the hospital, and it's a lockdown facility. You know, you have to go through locked door after locked door after locked door to get in there, and you feel like you're in a prison. It's painted gray, cinder block, very prison-like in looks, and then all of a sudden you're getting questions about, forms to fill out about having your child's schoolwork sent there. I'm like, what do you mean schoolwork? Hospital. You go in the hospital, you're out of the hospital. What do you mean schoolwork is going to be sent to you? You have no idea what you're in for, that your kid's probably going to be in this hospital for at least 2 weeks, at least. There's a good chance that once they're released, they're going to be in again. Kenny was out 6 days. He was in for 9 days, then he was out 6 days, then he was back in for 2 weeks, then he was out for a month. He was very proud of himself that he was out for a month. And then he was back in for 3 weeks inpatient and then 3 weeks outpatient. I mean, nowhere in the world does anyone prepare you for that. And it's probably one of the saddest places, I think, in the world to be, because there's such a lack of hope there. Everyone's doing their best to help, but you're just not sure. Are you going to be able to get your kid out of the cycle of, admissions into the hospital, into the psychiatric hospital? And we actually were able to, for a good period of time, for a couple years. Kenny was able to live stably, He had some dips, but we kind of worked him through them at home. And I think if someone had sat me down in the beginning and said, Mrs. Baker, expect him to be here, and this is what's going to happen, and there's a chance he may be back. Like when they sent us home after his 9 days, here's his medicine, go. And I think they want you to have hope, but I as a parent would have liked to have been ready to know that, well, in 6 days, he was back again. And it was overwhelming, and no one prepared you for that. And as Kurt mentioned earlier, you couldn't tell your friends. You couldn't reach out, and you have your child who's acting odd, and you can't share with your friends. But there were just very few people you could tell. And even with Kenny, we're like, well, what do you tell your peers? How do you go back to school and tell your friends, I was in a psych ward? I mean, how do you tell your friends that without fear of being laughed at? How do I tell my friends without fear of being judged? Well, you must have done something wrong because your kid's in a psych ward. You just don't know what to do, where to turn, who to talk to. You don't know who to trust. So you keep it within yourself. And poor Caitlin, she was in 8th grade, 7th grade. And here she doesn't know what to tell her friends about her brother. I have to say, in the beginning, we told them to lie to people because you didn't know what the reaction was going to be.